Ever wondered what the deal is with saying Shema while drunk? Well, that's exactly what we're going to discuss in this 168th episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing l'chaim to life. We're talking about Drunken Shema. Now, this comes out, well, we actually have text one, but this topic came up when we were looking at for our Drunkenness in Rabbinic Text series. So one of these texts that appears in the Talmud Yerushalmi is a conversation about how drunk can you be to pray. And that conversation actually has a parallel in the Babylonian Talmud, and that's pretty well established. I will say also, as I was going through these sources, there's a lot of reference to prayer under the influence, and I realize that's not something we've tackled yet, and so that's clearly something down the road, months away, a topic I'll tackle. But what we also subsequently saw was what we have here in text 1, which is Rabbi Zera asked before Rabbi Asi, may a drunk person recite grace. Now we, in our last session, explored this. What's the deal with drunken grace after meals? Birkat Hamazon, and we saw stuff. Okay, but then this question arises in the course of this conversation. What about reciting the Shema under the influence, or being drunk? So we have this story. Abba Bar Avin said, a pious person asked Elijah, may he be remembered for the good. May a naked person recite the Shema, which has nothing to do with being drunk. He said to him, he should not see you in a thing of turpitude, a word of turpitude. Continues, Chizkiah taught both for reciting grace and for reading the Shema. And what emerges from this is that maybe we should not be doing either grace after meals or Shema from this final line in this section. Now, this obviously, as we saw in the grace after meals conversation, there's some differing opinions around grace after meals drunk. And then we also saw that there's different levels of drunkenness. And I, only skimming the surface, thought, ooh, wow, I can only imagine how complicated Shema is going to be. So I'm going to have that second, because maybe drunken Birkat Hamazon, drunken grace after meals is going to be a less complicated thing, and drunken Shema is going to be more complicated. Spoiler alert, this is way simpler than our previous one. Shockingly so. But
we don't have 15 levels of drunkenness?
We don't. Which I was surprised, actually. So, but just from this text, it seems that, this is the only text in all of rabbinic literature that talks about drunken Shema, and it seems to say it's not something you're supposed to do. It's something like you're not allowed to do, seemingly. So then text 2, you say, okay, well, what about Rambam? What does Rambam have to say?
One who reads the Shema of the night after dawn, but before sunrise, does not fulfill his obligation unless he was unavoidably detained, drunk, sick, or severe situation. A person who was so detained and reads the Shema at this time does not recite the blessing of Leah's damage.
This is all the only text that Maimonides talks about drunken Shema. It's not, he's basically saying you can find this little tiny piece of temporal wiggle room in the late night / maybe potentially possibly early morning that you ideally are not supposed to be saying Shema now. But maybe you were drunk when you were supposed to, or you fell asleep and you woke up. You can now slip it in, and according to this lenient position, now say it. Now, this emerges actually from one of the texts we saw in the drunkenness text of the Babylonian Talmud. These two young men, I don't know if they're names, but they were at Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's son's or daughter's wedding. And at some point, they approach a rabbi, can we say the Shema now? It's like the end of the night. Like, this is like 5 a.m. So they ask, and basically the answer they receive is this really lenient position that nobody should follow. It's about what is the cutoff time for saying Shema at the end of the night?
Meaning they missed it to say it when they went to sleep, or they're trying to say it before when you wake up?
They're trying to say it to get in the nighttime Shema. But it's like 5 a.m. or 4:30 a.m. or whatever. And it's this weird time that you've already started to have dawn emerge, but sunrise has not yet occurred. So normally we say, well, once dawn happens, that's like we're talking morning time, night is over. This is the only this is a really lenient position. This comes out of a conversation in Tractate Brachot in the Babylonian Talmud. This story of these. Now, it's not clear when you're reading this, is this they stayed up all night partying, or they dozed off during the party and they woke up and realized they have their chance now to say Shema. Unclear. Rashi seems to think they dozed off. I think we've been at parties, and it's also really possible they just could have stayed up the whole night partying and then like
You got carried away.
exactly. It's totally imaginable. But from these, well, that's all that Rambam talks about. He also does talk about that maybe it is a matter of anus, that it's onus, that you were somehow unavoidably detained. What's also really shocking is how much of a dearth there is of medieval texts talking about this topic. With drunken Birkat Hamazon, at least there was more. With drunken prayer, there's a lot. But with drunken Birkat Hamazon, we saw some. There's almost none. We're going to see something, actually, we're going to see something very soon regarding like a couple of medieval rabbis, but it's not, like even Rambam doesn't mention Drunken Shema. We could go into it. He goes into some rabbinic texts, which is really interesting. One of the things he talks about is the thing I mentioned about these I think they were students, this pair of rabbis that, but then he also mentions this thing from the very first Mishnah, which is regarding the sons of Rabban Gamliel come home after midnight. They were at a drinking house. Now, I've always thought that's really interesting, right? They're coming home after midnight. We don't know if they're stumbling in and he's like in a robe in the kitchen waiting for them or what. We don't exactly know the scenarios, but they're in a drinking house and they're coming in past midnight and they're asking their dad, oh, we missed the time to say Shema. He's like, oh, this ruling about you're really supposed to say Shema before the middle of the night is really just a safeguard. You're allowed actually to say it until dawn. There's a conversation in what Rabbi Cairo here in text 3 mentions is actually he's quoting Rabbi Asher, who writes that these sons of Rabban Gamliel, they just happen to have continued drinking. He basically says, no, they weren't drunk. He basically is trying to say that they were, he creates this distinction of like, no, they were not drunk. And not only that, but there's also these sons of Rabban Gamliel who were out at a drinking house. That is one thing, but this pair of rabbis who were at someone's wedding, that was like a mitzvah drinking. That was a very different scenario. Context matters. And I'm like, I'm not sure. And I think this would be really fun to like really dive into in his consideration of all these different situations. But it is interesting that he does mention that there are, one of the great things about this particular work of Rabbi Kairos is that it's like a summary of a bunch of medieval rabbis. So he is mentioning some of these, but they're going off of these other stories of drinking and drunkenness and trying to figure out, are these drunkenness of Shema or not? But it's not entirely clear. Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode on Drunken Shema. I wanted to break in and give you a sneak peek on the Jew who grew the George Dickel brand, featuring his great-grandson. Here's a sneak peek, right?
In 1848, in the city directory in Nashville, it was SHWAB. Thereafter, when it was SCHWAB in the U.S. Census, etc. But then in 1870, Abraham Schwab in Youngstown, Ohio again, Abraham was SHWAB.
Hope you enjoy that sneak peek into next week's episode. Now back into this episode on Drunken Shema. Text 4, we have this Shulchan Aruch, which is the set table. This is written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. He is a Sephardi rabbi. And then there is this younger contemporary, living in Krakow, Poland, is Rabbi Moshe Esselis. And he basically adds on to the Shulchan Aruch. It literally means, by the way, Shulchan Aruch is a set table. And he writes this mapah, which is a tablecloth. And he throws in various Ashkenazi customs, but also mentions other opinions that he thinks should be mentioned, even those that Rabbi Cairo knows and has written about in that previous work we saw in text 3. So this is in the section regarding drunken prayer.
If one drank as much as Rebbe eats,
it's a few ounces
of wine. It isn't much then, I guess, if you're talking about wine. It's like
exactly
a very small glass. One may not pray the Amidah until the effect of one's wine passes. It's kind of a lightweight.
Mhm.
Really.
Yeah.
If one drink more than a Rebbe, if one is able to speak as before a king, that reminds me of last time. If one prays,
Mhm.
one's prayer is considered a prayer. And if one is not able to speak as before a king, if one prayed, one's prayer is an abomination. Good word.
Mhm.
And one is required to go back and pray again when the effect of one's wine passes from one. And even if the time of prayer passed, one should make it up for it in the prayer that follows it, in accordance with the law of one who unintentional transgresses.
So I'm going to pause here. So this is what Rabbi Cairo writes. Definitely something is worthy of at least one, if not multiple, explorations into drunken prayer. This is something that has lots of different levels. There's more levels than the drunken Birchan Hamazon, as we saw previously. Also, so I want to point out some of the things that we've been exploring recently, aside from the whole series on drunkenness. But back in September, we did a session on duchening under the influence, the priestly blessing. So that's a pretty obscure practice. So in Israel, it happens every Shabbat, and in Jerusalem every day. But here in the diaspora, at least for Ashkenazim, I'm not speaking for Sephardim, but for Ashkenazim, this happens 13 times a year. And it's only for Kohanim. So this is a pretty rare thing, and the likelihood of Kohanim being under the influence when this happens is so incredibly rare. It's whatever. So, okay, fine. That was one.
So most likely to happen in Jerusalem.
That's actually, yeah. Then we did the Birchan Hamazon under the influence. That's pretty likely to happen because when does drunkenness happen? Often when you're drinking. When does a lot of drinking happen? When you're consuming, like at a meal, right? That's pretty often. Shema, if we think about it, also if we're going to bed, I said something to someone about this, and he said, well, I usually go to pray in the evening anyways at shul, so then I start only drinking later. I said, well, what about it's the summer, and the sun sets super late, and it gets dark really late, and you say Shema really late, so maybe you already started drinking? He's like, fair point. I do also wonder, it's not really likely, but it could occur, what about the morning Shema? We're not usually drinking in the morning, but who knows, maybe it's a late night. I don't know. It's a theoretical possibility. You could wake up. Yeah, I would consider it.
In the morning Shema, or you could do one of these 5 a.m.ers.
Right, could be.
And you missed it. And
That's right.
Already
Exactly. So it's a possibility, but nevertheless, I think. But nighttime Shema, Birchan Hamazon are going to be a lot more frequently recurring of a potential drunkenness than the the priestly blessing. But one thing that all of these topics share is they do frequently refer back to the laws around prayer. Okay, how intoxicated can you be when you pray? So because that's pretty, they set up the scaffolding. It's pretty clear. And really, this is on me that one day we should explore drunken prayer or praying under the influence. It's DUI, it's davening under the influence, right? So it's, it's praying under the influence. So nevertheless, this sets up obviously this, but really quickly.
Are you saying to the gates, if you're too inebriated in the gates to pray?
For praying? So if you have a little bit, ideally you shouldn't pray, but if you pray, it's fine. However, if you're drunk, that's a problem. Hey there, I wanted to break in yet again. Although I asked for support in financial ways because it does cost some money to make the hosting happen and other aspects of Jewish drinking happen. So your financial support is definitely appreciated. And don't forget, you can go to jewishdrinking.com/donate. But also, another way of supporting the show and everything that Jewish Drinking does is also to tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you like this content, if you like this show, maybe people you know also like it. So feel free to let them know, hey, I have this interesting episode I heard, or a few episodes, or whatever it is, or even a few clips. Feel free to share with your friends. All right, thank you so much. Now back into the show.
And the law of the recitation of Shema is the same as the law of Lamidal prayer. Regarding other blessings, one may say them even if he is drunk.
So he does say two things. One is, even if you're drunk, you can still say the blessings, but Shema is just like prayer, meaning if you've had a little bit to drink, that's fine. If you are basically able, if you are still able to speak in front of the king, you can still say Shema, but once you're drunk, then you can't say Shema anymore. Then this is problematic. I did not quite track down these two sources that he's citing. I don't know if they're saying the same thing he's saying regarding the law that Shema is the same as prayer as far as drunk, or just about the ability to say the blessings. I'm not really quite sure, but either way, this is what Rabbi Yisraelis writes. This is a pretty significant text, and all subsequent rabbis are going to have to respond to this. That it becomes problem, and this is pretty clear that. Well, it's actually funny. I was about to say clear. It's not clear. I was about to say it's clear that he is going off of the Yerushalmi text, but I'm not so sure. Because the Yerushalmi text seems to say it's off limits. Drunken Shema is off limits. But here he's trying to fold it into this framework for prayer that having a little bit is fine, having a lot, being drunk and saying Shema is a problem. Spoiler alert, this is going to be a very significant text, text 5. Just as, and I will say this, just as we saw with the drunken Birkat Hamazon, there's this like one text that is quite significant and sort of changes the framework and the way we orient ourselves around it. And this is the same thing. This does the same. That one was Magin Avraham, Rabbi Avraham Gominer, that really set up a really helpful framework for the way that we consider our ability to say a drunken Shema. If anybody remembers, what he introduced was this notion of when you get to the level of drunkenness of lot, that is deeply problematic, and nobody should be saying grace after meals at that level. But any level of drunkenness below that is fine, although ideally one should cut one's meal short, say Birkat Hamazon, and then carry on drinking. Just don't get to the level of real drunkenness. But sometimes, like, you may be in the middle of the meal, like you still may be eating. And then so you want to stop yourself short, and then you can keep drinking afterwards. But what if you can't? Well, as long as you're not to the level of loads drunkenness, it's fine. But once you hit that, that's off limits. Which I was thinking about this on the way, like today while I was driving around. I'm like, what are the thoughts going through your mind? Like, oh, I have no idea what's flying right now. I am so beyond drunk. I am like loads drunkenness. I don't know what's going up or down. Oh wait, I can't say grace after meals right now. I don't know that's you have those like very clear thoughts going on in your head at that moment.
I imagine if you're that drunk, you're probably not.
Right. It's really hard. Like, oh, I should totally. You're not going to remember it either. Like it's right, which is kind of like the silly point of Rabbi Gombriner's thing. But aside from that, it's this incrementality of ideally you should say Birkat Hamazon before you really. But one of the problems to that is, what if you're still in the midst of a meal, you're still consuming stuff, you're still whatever. With Shema, we don't have that, because Shema is Shema. Once it hits nighttime, there's a time for it. You can say it. Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I wanted to break in and actually let you know this is not the only episode on drunkenness to come out this year. In fact, we have a whole handful of episodes coming out in a little mini series on drunkenness. So you can go check out this along with other episodes all at jewishdrinking.com/drunkenness for episodes, clips, and more. And I hope you're enjoying this episode. I hope you go and check out those other episodes on drunkenness. And now back into this episode on drunkenness.
There's what to be stringent regarding drunken reading of the Shema, and there are those who are lenient, since it is different than prayer, since prayer is a requesting of one's needs from the king, and one needs to have a greater sense of one's mind being settled, as well as awe and fear. Then there is with reading of the Shema, and all the more so other blessings, that one is able to bless them even though one is drunk. Since the Torah says, and you will eat, be satiated, you shall bless, which means to say that the drinking is similar, as will be explained in its place with the help of God. Even this, the Torah says, and you shall bless.
He's talking about grace after meals, having this push, having this line in Deuteronomy, you still nevertheless are obligated to bless. So, and that's kind of tied up in that same pericope, it's a fancy word, but that same section in the Talmud Yerushalmi with the grace after meals. The grace after meals with Shema. There's sort of this like Torah force behind it versus other blessings.
Yamida is not a
It's rabbinic.
It's rabbinic.
It's rabbinic.
Not derisa. It's not a
Right.
not a written. Whereas
Shema and grace after meals are Torah level.
Right.
Yeah. And he also points out, so his first line kicks off by saying, there's what to be stringent. If you want to be stringent, good. That's wonderful. Go be stringent and not do drunken Shema. Then it says v'yesh makilin. But you could also be lenient around this. And then he provides the particular reasoning that prayer is, you need a higher level of intentionality because you're requesting your needs from God. You need to be focused and really in the zone for that. Shema, you don't need that. He actually doesn't say what there is for Shema. He just says you need to have a greater sense of awe or fear than there is with the reading of the Shema. And he just moves on. And then all the more so with other blessings. He provides at least a reason that there is a notable difference. He's creating daylight here between prayer, drunken prayer, and what's going on in your mind versus drunken Shema. Text 6 is a commentary on text 5. The Rabbi Spira, and he basically quotes text 5. There are those who lenient. It's different than prayer. It's a requesting one's needs. And text 7, I'll quickly mention. I know I didn't translate this, but the important thing to note here is he mentions that Radad din kriyat shema kedin tefillah, that you should know that the law regarding kriyat shema as far as drunkenness is just like prayer. And then he continues, of all shar brachos, other blessings, and also Birkat Hamazon, yachol levarech av kushu shikor, even when you're drunk. Now, he does talk about these other things. What about your onus? You're not allowed to say it. I will point this out. He says, Anias daiti, in my humble opinion, nir lahachriya devishtia shal mitzvah, that it seems that one should consider that mitzvah drinking, kamos udatz mitzvah v'chayotze, such as you're at a mitzvah meal, maybe you're at a wedding, and other similar situations. Uchumasa dezuge de Rabbana Gemara, like that thing in Brachot and the Babylonian Talmud with these two rabbis who are at this wedding, drinking late into the night. Even if you had already begun after the time that had kicked off, versus an optional drinking, you're no longer called accidental as opposed to intentionally sinning. You're accidentally sinning. Va'anus or anus is somehow being you didn't mean to be drunk. Elohim Cain. Nevertheless, itchilu kodem hagatzman, unless you had already began before the time of saying Shema. Hello, dear listeners. It's your host, Rabbi Drew. I wanted to break in right now and just say, hey. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate, or watching, however you're consuming this content. And I'm always open for new ideas, both for specifically the Jewish Drinking Show, whether it's topics, whether it's guests. I'm also looking for other resources that I can provide you with in the Jewish Drinking Project more broadly. Also, I'd really like to offer you the opportunity to sponsor this work. Whether if you want to go to patreon.com/Jewish Drinking, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you have ideas for swag, also, please feel free to send them to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. All right, thank you so much, L'chaim, and now back into the episode. Now we move on to text 8. So text 8 and 9 are basically the same author. Pretty significant. His name is Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan. So he writes here in text 8, this is his Mishnah Berurah, the translation for which, fancy translation, is clarified teaching. This is composed around the turn of the 20th century. A lot of what he does is also kind of like a survey, but this is a sort of modern rabbinic literature, so post 15th, 16th century.
The matter of prayer, which is that even one who has been drinking ideally should not read the recital of the Shema. Rabbi Mordechai ben Avram Yofi wrote in his Lavush that there are those who are lenient with the reading of the Shema, even if one is drunk, since it is different than prayer, which is requesting of one's needs. And similarly, has it been found in the collective writings of Rabbi Moses ben Nachman at the end. However, Rabbi Elijah ben Solomon Zalman wrote in his explanations where he expanded to explain the words in the Talmud Yerushalmi that regarding this matter, according to his words, the conclusion of the Talmud Yerushalmi was that it forbids drunkenly reciting the Shema. Therefore, one should ideally be careful not to come to that situation. However, if one does end up getting drunk and still needing to read out Shema, One cannot exempt oneself when reading of the Shema on account of this consideration. Similarly, has Rabbi Moses Isserlis written further on in regarding the grace after meals that if one's wine expires, as long as the time to read the Shema is not passed, one should go back and read the paragraphs of the Shema.
I probably should have said, instead of wine expires, wine wears off. Maybe that's a more, I think, an understandable translation for that. But, so I mentioned he does a little bit of a review. We've seen, aside from this Rabbi Moses ben Nachman and also this Vilna Gaon, which is this Rabbi Elijah. What's interesting about Rabbi Elijah, so this is the Vilna Gaon, that it's what we read. And according to Talmud Yerushalmi, it should be that we cannot read Shema while drunk. But he says, so ideally one should not come to that situation. So a workaround, very simple one, it's a lot easier to accomplish in the winter months, is once it hits the time for reading the Shema in the nighttime, read it before you start your drinking. Of course, if you are in the summertime, it's a lot harder because. So I am talking about, I'm glad you asked that. So there is an obligation. So I'm going to get a little nerdy and technical about this. So the nerdy thing is the obligation is to say Shema in the morning and Shema in the night. So even though it's been worked into the prayer service that we have it, and there's like blessings on both sides of it leading up to prayer in both the morning and the evening. Maybe the evening prayer doesn't happen for everyone, but at least bedtime Shema, that's definitely very important to say. So maybe if someone wasn't praying the evening prayer service, so then you still have an obligation to say at the bedtime, right? Along with saying the Hamapiel as the blessing, and then people have these practices to say other verses or poems. So if you are someone who, let's say, prays the evening service and or goes to shul to do so, it's a lot more easily accomplished. Actually, I'll say two other things. A, it's going to be a lot more easily accomplishable in the winter or any other time where the sun's setting at an earlier time. So that's part one. But part two is, what if you go to a congregation, especially in the summertime, you go to an evening prayer service, and just because it can get really late, especially on the western end of the time zone, you're praying way ahead of the time that it's actually time for saying Kriyat Shema. So effectively, the most effective way to accomplish it is when you're doing your bedtime Shema. So that could also be another time that it would be occurring. So I've laid out multiple options. Hopefully I didn't get too technical and nerdy about it, but there's different parameters and different ways that could work. And some of those lend themselves more to running into the situation, and some are more easily accomplishable. Like I mentioned, if, let's say, one were to have gone to shul this evening, prayed with a minyan, or even prayed before coming here and incorporated Shema, boom, they knocked it out. But let's say you're waiting till bedtime to say Shema, the full thing, then it becomes a little bit more of a question. He's saying ideally you shouldn't come to that situation. But what if you have? What if, let's say after tonight, who knows, maybe you've drank a fair amount, and you're like, okay, it's time for Shema. I'm drunk. Uh-oh. Well, ideally I should have said Shema already. But now that I'm here, he says you cannot exempt yourself from reading out of the Shema just because you're drunk. Too bad. You're still under obligation. This is still a mitzvah. But it's also the mirror image of Birkat Hamazon. What we saw last with the Birkat Hamazon conversation was you still have this this mitzvah of the Achalta V'Tzavata Urach. It's a very clear directive from the Torah. Who cares if you're drunk? You still got to say it. And so it seems I almost feel like he's not saying it, but he's thinking it. Of like, this is still a Torah level mitzvah of saying Shema. And then he mentions with 185. So if you don't know these numbers, section 185 is the Birkat Hamazon section, which is a great segue for text 9. So this is the Biur Halacha on 185, which is the Birkat Hamazon conversation, but it is relevant even for us. Because these two are interlinked, the Birkat Hamazon and the Shema. Like, to prayer is really its own thing. And then we have these two, which are they're a pair of Birkat Hamazon and Shema, because they're both biblical level commandments. Starts out by saying, see what is written in clarified teaching, what we wrote in the name of matter that one who is drunk is permitted to say all blessings aside from prayer, since when one is praying, one should consider oneself as if one is in front of the king, with the textual proof to this position being from the Talmud Yerushalmi, such as Rabbi Abraham Gombiner And that's something we saw previous sessions. See there. However, Rabbi Elijah ben Solomon Zalman, that's Vilna Gaon, wrote in his explanations in 99, that's Shema, that it is inferable since he opines that even according to the Talmud Yerushalmi, it is not clear if drunken Shema is permissible, since he explains that what it says there is what Chizkiah said, whether reading the Shema or blessing the grace after meals, which would be stringent to not say them. That's from text 1. And Chizkiah disagrees upon the lenient statement previously in that pericope regarding the grace after meals. Nevertheless, it is possible that Rabbi Elijah ben Solomon Zalman, that's the Vilna Gaon, would also admit that once one is drunk, one blesses the grace after meals, according to the opinion of Rav Asi, that's in the Talmud Yerushalmi, who permits saying it previously in the pericope. Similarly, okay, they're linked together, they're tied up together, these two. And then we have at the very end, this is a 20th century work in text 10, written by a Sephardi rabbi who quotes this notion of a din kriyat shema kedin tefillah. He quotes the Rabbi Yisrael's things, but then he says, and this basically is quoting text number 5, V'ish Mekilin Deshayni Tefillah Shehi B'Kashet Tzuraka Min HaMelech. Okay, that kriyat shema is notably different than prayer. Prayer, you're requesting your needs from God. Shema, you're just reading out verses from Deuteronomy and Numbers. Like that doesn't require the same level of intensity of intentionality. It doesn't need the same intentionality around it. Like you have to know what you're saying, but like you don't need as much mental intentionality.
Same thing, like you're just
yeah. Well, you ideally should. There, the motivator is. So it seems that Shema, okay, it's a recitation, which is, I think, when we think about even just the language of calling it kriyat Shema, it's literally you're just doing a recitation of the Shema. You're going through these verses in Deuteronomy and Numbers. Great. Birkat Hamazon, really the major drivers we saw was this notion of it's still a mitzvah. You can't just get out of it just because it's because you're drunk. Well, you still you're obligated to say it. So say it. Hopefully you should have some intentionality of what you're saying. And then there's prayer. Prayer really demands intentionality. And that's something of course, when we talk about prayer, we can definitely delve more deeply into, but there's a lot of talk about kavanat halev, of mental intentionality around prayer, which these other practices don't seem to really necessitate as much.
Interesting, because I think at their core, they really should, for what they are.
Yeah.
Right?
it's Torah mitzvah versus request.
Yeah. These are just, it's interesting because Kriya Shema, okay, you're essentially just reading them. Like, great.
Yeah, I would think,
Yeah.
when I think of the Shema,
You'd also want it to
I think
sink
of the
in.
most intentional declaration of being Jewish. And
So,
dedicating ourselves to Hashem.
well, that seems to be something that we saw in text 8, that ideally you should be doing this not drunk.
Right.
Ideally. But once you're there,
Because it's a mitzvah.
then you can't just get out of it, oh, I'm drunk, sorry. Prayer, you can. That's a different conversation for another time. And that's a lot more intricate and a lot more many more gallons of ink have been spilled over intoxicated prayer. But clearly, we saw really some of the more salient texts, and there's probably others out there, but like there's not as much written out there, and it's not as hotly debatable as even Birkat Hamazon. We saw a lot more different positions around that. You have really this notion of ideally you shouldn't do it drunk, but if you say Shema before you get drunk, but once you're there, you have this Torah obligation, say it, that's fine. And there's this notion that gets tied up with some of these rabbis of saying it's just like prayer. But if it's like prayer, that means you can be be tipsy or whatever. You can have had some drinks, but drunken prayer is problematic, so maybe drunken Shema is also problematic. But also, there are those who are lenient, because this is something that is noticeably different than prayer that requires that intentionality. So ultimately, at the end of the day, all you need to know is it's okay.
For praying,
Yeah.
if it comes time for mincha,
Mm-hmm.
you're too drunk,
Mm-hmm.
skip it.
Yes.
And there's no you didn't sin, you didn't transgress.
It's better to not pray a prayer if you are drunk than to pray it.
But Shema, you're
better to do it.
Better to do it then. Very, 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 very tail end of text 8. It says that if Similarly, with regarding the grace after meals, if your wine has worn off, as long as the time to read the Shema has not passed, one should go back and read the paragraphs of the Shema. Meaning, let's say, putting this out as a theoretical, okay? So right now it's 9:34. Let's say we're drunk. We're not, but let's say we are. And we either go to sleep right now or we stay up and let the wine wear off. Either way, and then we wake up at 4 a.m. It's still time. We can say it. Now, are we totally not drunk? I don't know, but maybe it's worn off enough. And now at least the time's not worn off. So you can maybe just let your mind clear, maybe sober up a bit. So that's a strategy.
So it finds there's an intentionality less drunk.
Yes. So, well, that's also something we saw. That's also something we saw in text 8. He says, therefore, one should ideally be careful not to come to that situation. Basically, the idea is like, if you are on the road to getting drunk, maybe you say Shema at that moment before you get there.
Drinking holiday?
So it's a great question. So, Purim, Simchat Torah is easy because it's already baked in that you're saying Kriyat Shema before you start drinking.
Right.
So that's easy. Purim is a very different conversation because, well, obviously the first night of Purim, you pray before you start drinking. And then the morning, you also pray before you start drinking. The real issue is what happens at the end of Purim.
You're drunk from
And you're drunk, and then now you have to do nighttime Shema. I think that's when this comes into application. You're not going to do, probably not going to pray, but this becomes very relevant. It's this year it's a Friday, so that's going to be really interesting. But really, any time it's going to be Purim. Probably by the time Purim's ending and it's moving on to the next Jewish day, right? That night you're going to be drunk. Possibly, you're very likely to be drunk. It's very possible, or people And now what? Okay, well now you know this halakha, and great, this is useful. Boom, and it'll be interesting this year. It's a Friday, so
This year it's like,
which are always really fun.
So I guess it's Shema, yes.
Yeah. Well,
No, yeah, I mean,
prayer no, Shema yes.
yes.
Which is also interesting because who asked the Purim question? Was it you? Because this is something that comes up with the Purim stuff. This is a brief survey that really does not do it justice, but basically have one rabbi after another in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. They're like, oh, but what happens to Birkat Hamazon and prayer? And the next one says, well, what about washing hands in Birkat Hamazon and prayer? And the next one says, what about washing hands in Birkat Hamazon and prayer and also Shema? And then what about they keep adding, and they're like, then there's 8 or 10 different things they're really worried about. If you happen to get drunk in Purim, you're losing out on all these mitzvot. Blah, blah, blah. And it turns out, fine, prayer you lose out on, but grace after meals and Shema, you're good. You can do those drunk. That's fine. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this Drunken Shema episode, a drinks and discussion episode. Hopefully you found it enlightening, interesting, and otherwise. And with that, I wish everybody l'chaim.